God is good. And all the time. I didn't want to hold a mic in my hand, but saying that they give me a mic, they must want me to preach. So I was going to be holding, when you're holding the mic, you sort of have to do something with it. You can't just hold the mic and not do anything with it. So if I start to lean to the right or to the left, just tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, hold on to something. Exodus chapter 3. God is moving, and we see here in Exodus chapter 3 that anytime God is moving, he uses a man and he places that man on a mission. And in Exodus chapter 3, in verse 7 through 9, we see something very interesting. I want you to read this because this is, I'm going to go before and after this to go through the life of Moses up to a point, but just to show one fact that when God moves, he chooses someone and he places them on a mission. When God moves, he chooses someone and he places them on a mission. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 7 to 9, it says, "And the Lord said, I surely have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from the land to good and a spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, including the Megabites and the Terabites." And now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. May the Lord add the blessing to the reading of his words. I just want to say one thing. When God is on the move, you might be in a state where you feel like everything is against you. You may be oppressed, you may be depressed, you may be suppressed, but God is going to deliver you out of them all. And that is something that we can always count on, that God will deliver us out of them all. But see, we have to know that when this is happening, God is moving in spite of where we are, in spite of what we may be going through. God is always moving. He never stops. Our Father and our God, we give you glory and we give you praise this day for all that you have done and for all that you're about to do. Guide our hearts and our minds as we enter into your word, that you would be glorified. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. I think we all know the story of Moses. The story of Moses is a very interesting story, how God brought Moses up. So if we look just a little bit at Moses' background, we're going to look at the man and the mission, the man and the mission, the man and the mission. Now, God chose Moses, but there's something interesting about Moses in Exodus chapter 1. We see how the Egyptian sons started to grow in numbers. After Joseph had died, there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and he did not know what Joseph accomplished for the nation of Egypt. And so what had happened, this Pharaoh just saw these Israelites growing numerously in numbers. They were like 600,000 men around that time, some 2 million Jewish people altogether, Israelites altogether. And so this Egyptian Pharaoh got a bit afraid. He was like, if these people rise up, they can take over my kingdom. So let us do something. Let us put them in bondage. Because they weren't slaves, mind you. These were free people who were just residing in the land of Goshen, which is under the providence of Egypt. So the Egyptian Pharaoh said, no, we need to do something. Let's place some chains on them. Let's now make them our slaves, and let's make them work very hard. Let's put them under the hands of the taskmaster. And that's what they did. And so Pharaoh had them now working very hard. And now these once freed people are now slaves in this land. And as being slaves, note this, that this didn't catch God by surprise that his people were enslaved. Because as a matter of fact, if you go to Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13, God said to Abraham, now this was some 400 years before. God said to Abraham, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. So God told Abram what was going to happen. It is now happening because 400 years have passed and they have been slaves in the land of Egypt. So don't think that when God's people's going through something, God doesn't know. See, we have a tendency to view God as if though he's man. No, God knew what we would have been going through before we started to go through it, because he's the one who has us to go through it. If he didn't want us to go through it, we wouldn't go through it. And so he has his people going through this time, but he's now coming on the scene. And so we see Moses here. Moses was born a slave. So he was born in a condition that he had no control over. He was born into slavery. We see that in Exodus chapter 1. We see in verse 15 of Exodus chapter 1, the king of Egypt, he didn't like how the number of the Israelites were growing, and so he ordered that all the sons who were being born be killed. It says in verse 15 of Genesis 1, then the king of the Egyptians spoke to the Hebrew midwives. In verse 16, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded, but they let the boys live. Then Pharaoh commanded all the people, saying, every son who is born, you are to cast them into the Nile, and every daughter you shall keep alive. And so we see Moses was born as a slave, but then something very interesting happened. They started to kill all the little boys. And I wish I was preaching another sermon, because that goes to this culture today. They're killing all the little boys. If I was preaching, I would say, they're killing all our sons. They're making our sons believe that they are women. And They're doing some strange things. They're taking them out of the wombs of their mother and putting them to death. And even when they come out, they're telling them they're girls and wanting them to wear skirts. They're doing something to our boys. But that's another story. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this right here. See, Moses was born in slavery. And even though he was born in slavery, his life is so difficult that it hasn't even started yet because he was born a slave. Now, he has to run for his life, but he don't even know what to do because he has no control over it. So his mother has to jump in and do something. Because we see now, Moses is an infanticide survivor. All the young boys are being killed. Some are being saved by the midwives, but Pharaoh just gave another decree, and now he's running around trying to kill all the boys. Why is he trying to kill the boys? Because there is no generation without men. When you remove the man, you remove the next generation. Women can't do nothing by themselves other than, watch this, he knew they could mix the women. This is why he didn't kill the women. Oh, because if the women become Egyptians, they can become Egyptians and their children will be Egyptians because the fathers is what make the son or the daughter what they are. I'll say that again. It's through the line of the father that a name continues. Destroy all the fathers, they have no name. They have no identity. They have no direction. They have no purpose. I'm saying something because we're seeing this in America. When you take away the father, when you destroy manhood, when you take away manhood, what you are doing is destroying the generation to come. But that's okay. They're trying to kill Moses from his birth. He was born a slave. Now they're trying to kill him, infanticide, and he survived that. And so it says, Pharaoh's daughter was in the Nile because Moses' mother hid him and she placed him in a basket, and the basket is going down the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter is there at the Nile. She sees the baby, hears him crying, and then she tells someone to fetch him. They bring him. She falls in love with him, say, oh, I want. Now Moses' sister is watching this. You all know the story. Moses' sister is watching, and she ran to Pharaoh's daughter, say, hey, I can find someone to take care of him. And so she goes and calls her mother. And Pharaoh's daughter says, take care of the child and bring him to me when he's of age. That means when he's not feeding his mother's milk anymore. And she's now paying his mother to take care of him. Ain't God good? She's now paying his mother to be his nanny. I've never seen nothing like that in my life. So now she's getting paid to be a mother. And so Moses now is safe, but he goes from being a slave to escaping infanticide. But now it says in chapter 2 and verse 10, the child grew up and she brought him, speaking of his mother, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, Pharaoh's daughter's son. And she named him Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. So he went from being a slave, escaping infanticide, to being a prince. God has a sense of humor. From being a slave to escaping infanticide, he's now a prince. But something happens because Moses had a temper problem. He got angry a lot. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get angry on 75. And so in order to avoid that anger, I turn on 635 when rage comes. And so God has to help suppress when I'm in my car and putting my foot down. I think there's a spirit in my right foot, and I try to loose that spirit and bind that spirit, but the spirit just keeps pressing down for some reason. But God has to control us. We have to give ourselves over to the Spirit. We have to yield ourselves to the Spirit. But Moses, at this point, Moses has grown up. Now, he has grown up as an Egyptian. He has a sense of who the Hebrew people are, but he don't know them nor their God. But Moses he saw a Hebrew being beaten by an Egyptian. And Moses jumped in and killed the Egyptian. Now, I find this very curious, and I'm not going to go into this, but it wouldn't have mentioned this if Moses just had killed a regular Egyptian, because he's a prince. So why would Pharaoh come behind a prince for killing a commoner? This person wasn't a commoner, apparently. Most likely, this person was some sort of chief ruler, and that person was their slave. And Moses killed probably a chief official for a slave. And Pharaoh found out about it, and Pharaoh tried to kill Moses. I'm like, how do you try to kill somebody? Pharaoh, just send 2,000. If you send 100 guys to catch him, they're going to catch him. So how did Pharaoh try to kill him?
I must say that they must have been together, and Pharaoh physically tried to attack him because he was a prince living in the palace. That's my pontification. So he's a prince living in this palace, and we see this thing taking place now. And so Moses kills the Egyptian, and now Pharaoh is behind him. So Moses is now a murderer. He goes from a slave, escaping infanticide, being a prince. He's now a murderer. All this happened within 40 years. He's now a murderer. So he has to run now. It says, when Pharaoh heard this, in Exodus chapter 2, verse 15 says, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled his presence, the presence of Pharaoh, and settled in the land of the Median, and he sat down by the well. Now, Moses, from a slave, escaping infanticide, becoming a prince, he's now a murderer on the run. He's in exile. But look where he ran to, another pagan land. He went from a place that worshiped many gods to another place that worshiped many gods, from a city to a country. And now he's in the land of the Midianites. And in the land of the Midianites, he's under a Midianite priest. And in this land, as soon as he arrived there, it says in chapter 2, verse 21, Moses was willing to dwell with this man, this Midianite priest, because he gave Moses his daughter. Now what happened, the story, backtrack a bit. Moses, when he ran to this well, and these ladies were at the well, and they were trying to feed their cattle, and these shepherds came, and they were running away the ladies, because at that time, people take what they wanted and take what didn't belong to them. And so Moses saw that. Now here's what's crazy. It was a bunch of shepherds, but only Moses. So Moses was skilled in some sort of jiu-jitsu or something, because Moses ran off a group of guys. It wasn't just one guy. And Moses, one guy, ran off a group of guys, and they ran. And so when the Midianite priest, his daughter Zipporah, saw that, she went running back, and she ran and said, Dad, these guys came to run us away from the well. They came to take our stuff. And this Egyptian guy, now how does she know he was an Egyptian? Because Egyptians look different than folks off in the country. See, it's something about people who look different. You know how we discriminate against people who look different. But this man who looked different, because apparently Egyptians were clean-faced and clean bald. They used to wear those wig things, and their hairs were bald. And here's the thing, though. When we see this taking place, they went out, and she went out, and she called her dad, and she saw this Egyptian guy, and her dad came and said, invite him to dinner. And they brought him, and then he said, you want to stay? Moses says, yes. He said, you have to marry my daughter. In other words, you have to become one of us. You have to leave your Egypt behind you, and you have to become one of us. So Moses became one of them. He became a Midianite. So Moses went from being a slave, went from escaping infanticide, went from being a prince, a murderer in exile. He's now a shepherd. He's now watching sheep. He was once a commander of men, but now he's a commander of sheep. Now, I don't know about you, but it's one thing to command man, but it's another thing to command sheep. See, because sheep are some very interesting animals. If the sheep don't know you, they ain't gonna follow you. And even when they know you, they so silly sometimes, they just follow the crowd. So you could be calling your sheep, and that sheep see another sheep going down the cliff. That sheep gonna follow that sheep down the cliff. That's what sheep do. But Moses didn't know about that, so God had to teach Moses how to be a sheep herder. Now, here's why he's teaching Moses how to be a sheep herder. Remember, Moses was a prince. Moses had the privilege. Why? He had to go to school. The only school at that time were the Egyptians, and they were the most educated people on the planet at that time. They came up with medicine and all that kind of good stuff. Right? They were the one who came up with embalming and how to keep the dead and how to keep the bodies right and so on and so forth. So Moses was under their tutelage. So for 40 years as a prince, he learned the ways of the Egyptian. He was a very smart man. As a matter of fact, the very first time we see the Hebrew language was when Moses penned it. So all of the Hebrew people, slaves didn't have education back then. I'm sorry. They didn't have education. Moses was like the only educated one at this time. So God used Moses as a prince to learn certain skills, but then he had him to learn some other skills. So the things happened. So 40 years he was a prince. Now he's in the land of the Midianites for 40 years because he had him to learn something else, how to watch sheep. Why was watching sheep important? Why would he take a prince to teach him how to watch sheep? I'm just saying there's a reason why King David said, the Lord is my shepherd and I shall not be in want. There's a reason why the scripture called the people of God sheep. See, because he's going to be teaching Moses, you're going to have some stubborn people with you. You're going to have to take a rod and hit some folk. You're going to have to do some things. Why? Because sheep are some crazy creatures. And I find it interesting that the Lord called me his sheep, because he knew how crazy I was going to be, so he was just showing us. But see, we see the man here, Moses, right? Moses, God called him out from being a slave to a prince. From being a prince, he's now an ex-con on the run, and now he's a pagan, a guy serving in a pagan land with a pagan priest watching sheep. That's the man. But here is the mission. Moses wasn't looking for God. Didn't want God, didn't desire God, didn't know who God was. So don't believe that Moses was some godly man. He was not. He had no idea who God was. So this man who was born a slave, survived infanticide, became a prince, commits murder. He's now in exile and a sheep herder living with a priest. God is going to now make him to be a deliverer. But the man isn't looking for this job. He doesn't want this job. This is not Moses' career choice. He didn't choose to be a leader of people. Moses did not know God or his people, but God had plans for Moses. And we see the mission. The mission is God-inspired. The mission comes in chapter 3, verse 7 through 9. God says, I have heard the voice, the cries of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries. I know their sufferings. So watch what he says, God saying this in Exodus chapter 3, verse 8. I have come down to deliver them. Wait a minute. But so who's Moses? Moses is just on a mission for God. Watch this. He's irrelevant. God could have used anyone. God chose to use him just because that was his purpose and plan. Just like Abram, how we call Abram out of Ur of the Chaldean. Abram did not know God. He was a Babylonian serving Babylonian gods. Most likely Moses only knew the Egyptian gods, and now he's serving in the land of the Midianites, so he's now serving the Midianite gods, and now this God comes to him. He's 80 years old now, 40 years as an Egyptian prince, 40 years as a sheep herder. So God takes time to teach us, but I think that's just how stubborn Moses was. It took him so long to get it. But even then, God comes and God says that I will deliver my people. So here is the mission. The mission is inspired by God, but I want you to note, every mission involves difficulties and obstacles. Every mission involves difficulties and obstacles. Why is that? Notice what he said in verse 8. He says, I'm going to take you to the place, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place, watch this, of the Canaanites, of the Hittites, of the Amorites, of the Perizzites, of the Hivites, of the Jebusites. In other words, God was taking him out of one difficult situation into another one, but this one would bring prosperity. God was delivering Moses out of one bad situation, using Moses to get his people to a place where his people wasn't even desiring to get. But in order to get there, you have to go through a battle. You have to go through a fight. You have to go first into the desert, into the wilderness, and then you're going to fight people to get the land, because you have to take the land from the people. So when God is calling you on a mission, it's not for punks. It's not for soft, wimpy people who want to sit back and say, well, Lord, why don't you do it? Well, Lord, I'm going to pray so you can do it. No, you can pray, and God has called us to pray, but at some time you need to take up your sword and start fighting, because God is calling them to take the land of the Hivites, not to walk around it and pray about it. He said to take it. So Moses had to be a taker. And he's saying that, you know, that when he's given us a task to do, we need to know what to do in the right time. There's a time to cry, and there's a time to laugh. There's a time to pray, and there's a time to act on what you prayed about. Sometimes we spend more time praying than having faith, believing, and doing. And so we use prayer as a crutch because we're not moving as God has called us to move. But here's the thing. Now he's showing Moses that there will be difficulties. In Exodus 3, verse 9, watch what he says. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come before me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians have oppressed them. So God has placed Moses on this mission now. He's calling Moses, placing him on this mission. God is inspired. He's inspiring this whole event. So God initiates the deliverance of his people beforehand. They don't know, the people don't know what God is doing. But God is doing it. He's working in Moses' life in such a way to set things up so that he can deliver his people. And so we see how God starts to direct Moses. Remember Moses, he was watching Jethro's sheep, and he went up to the mountain. There he saw this bush burning, and in the midst of the burning bush, when he approached the bush, he wanted to see what was going on, and God says to take your shoes off, for where you're standing is holy ground. And Moses took off his shoes, and he turned his face, and the Lord said, what's up? He says, I dare not look upon the Lord. And so all of a sudden, he goes from being, this person in the bush goes from being the angel of the Lord to God. And so we see here what is called a theophany, the appearance of Christ in the Old Testament, where he's in the midst of this burning bush. He's in the midst of the bush and he's burning, and he's talking to Moses. And the bush isn't burning, nor is he burning, but there's fire, and Moses can't understand what's going on. And so now he calls out to Moses, and he tells Moses, I have seen the affliction of my people. I'm sure Moses like, so? What? Like, what? You've seen the affliction of your people, so why are you telling me? Mind you, Moses is in the land of the Midianites. He's never lived with the Hebrews. He doesn't even know the Hebrew people. For 40 years after he killed that guy, he was in the wilderness with the Midianites for 40 years. He's never had relationship with the Hebrew people, nor their God. But the Hebrew God now approaches him and say, my people are in need. And I'm sure he's, okay. Okay. When God comes to us at times in these weird moments, we can be sleeping late, early in the morning, and he says things to us we don't understand. Be like, okay, why are you telling me that, Lord? See, sometimes the Lord will be speaking to us, telling us to do things that we don't understand, so we don't move. But I find it interesting here, God is directing Moses, and when God calls the man and places him on a mission, he's placing Moses on this mission, but God's plan was already predetermined. Moses didn't make the plan, God made the plan, and it was already predetermined what was going to happen. But throughout Moses' life, he never thought that he was not going to be a prince. Who in their right mind is a prince for 40 years believe on year 41, I won't be a prince anymore. So, of course, he thought all of his life he's going to be a prince, but after that event happened where he killed the guy and he was ran off, and now for 40 years he's a sheep herder. After being a sheep herder for 40 years, do you think he thought he was going to have a different career? No. It wasn't Moses' plan to do this. It was God's plan. Why? Because God had something for his people, so he was preparing the man to do the work that he had for his people. So God had a predetermined plan. In verse 19 of Exodus 3, he says, but I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So God is telling Moses, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, but I know Pharaoh is not going to let the people go unless I make him let the people go. So in verse 20 of chapter 3, he says, so I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it, and after that he will let them go. Notice, God never said you will strike Egypt with your hand and with your miracles. He says, I will strike Egypt with my hand and with my miracles. But wasn't Moses the one doing it? Yes. God was using Moses. Moses did not have any super skill or ability, as we will see. See, the mission, God has a predetermined plan to accomplish his mission. So God knows the end before the beginning and the beginning before the end, and he has purposed Moses to do something specific. In verse 21, it says, I will grant this people favor in my sight, in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be when they go, you will not go empty-handed. Thus, you will plunder the Egyptians. He says that when you leave, you would be there as slaves, but you're going to leave some rich folk. And guess what? They're still rich. God's mission never changes. In God's mission, God is the one who inspires the mission. He's the one who's directing the mission. He's the one who's predetermining the plan for the mission. And even though we may make plans, God will order our steps according to his perfect way and design. And so we see this in the life of Moses. But we also see something very important, and this is what I want you to note. You saw who Moses was and what he went through, and you see how God worked in his life. Now God has placed him on this mission to go into Pharaoh and to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And he said Pharaoh is going to be stubborn, he's not going to do it. And so I'm going to cause these things to happen. But Moses have a problem with this. I would too if I was him. Moses is saying, I hear what you're saying, but I'm a sheep herder. How can I go speak to a king? Not just the king, but this guy now is like the king of the world. I mean, like, how can I talk to him? How can I tell a king what to do? Go in the king's kingdom and say, let these people go? Look, you're trying to get me killed. Why? What did I do to deserve this? So Moses wasn't prepared. Listen, in Exodus chapter 4, verse 1, notice what it says. Then Moses said, what if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say to me, the Lord has not appeared to you. Speaking about God's own people. Notice what he says in verse 2. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? And he said, it is a staff. Then he said to him, throw it on the ground. So Moses threw it on the ground and turned into a serpent. Moses ran. He's like, whoa, what's going on, right? God said, pick it back up. And he picked it up. He picked it back up by the tail, and it turned back into a staff. Moses is now freaking out. See, because when God places a man on a mission, he equips the man. But notice what he's using. He's using what was in Moses' hand already. He didn't give Moses any new thing. He asked Moses the question in Exodus 4, verse 2. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? It's interesting, he never told Moses to go to any place to learn something new. He says, what is it that you have already? I will use that. Let me show you how I will use what you already have. You can take this insignificant thing and throw it on the ground. Throw it on the ground. Watch what happens. Bang, it turns into a snake. A dead thing turns into a living thing. God is saying, I can make the dead come to life. I can bring dead things to life. I can do things that will marvel everyone. And so we see, even though this man was not equipped, God started to equip the man because he uses whatever we may have. Now, I have a picture here of a staff. If you can show that picture. That's what Moses looked like, you know. Yes, Moses even had blue eyes with blondish hair, like, right, no. But anyway, I'm using it because of the staff. And so we see the staff there, right? So Moses had this staff, and that's what a staff looked like. It sort of looks like a stick. And there are some modern day staffs. You see there, and the one to the right to the top, it's an ancient staff they found. And so a staff was basically a piece of stick. It's just a piece of stick. Now here's the thing about sticks. They're just sticks. Unless God starts to use them. See, because God did not give Moses any special ability. He simply demonstrated his power through Moses. Moses didn't have no ability to do nothing. God was working through him to demonstrate how powerful he was in every situation. I'm saying that because God could be working in you to demonstrate how powerful he is through you. It's not you who have the gift. It's not me who have some great ability to do anything. God will use even a donkey to talk to a man. But that's another story. And so we see here in chapter 4, verse 12 to 13, it says, now then, go. Now God is telling Moses, and I will put my words in your mouth and teach you what you ought to say. Now, God is the one giving Moses the words to say, and God is the one teaching Moses. He says, but he said, please, Lord, send the message by someone else. Now, I don't know about you. You would probably be the one say, Moses tripping. I'm just like Moses. Lord, use somebody else. Like, why me? I don't know these people. Never been hanging out with them. And you're going to see Moses going to have a tough time. They don't like Moses. Because Moses coming, watch this, Moses coming telling them, here's what God is saying. No one wants to hear what God is saying, especially his own people. God's people will hang around and say, oh, I love me some Jesus. Oh, I love me some Jesus. Oh, and they will start singing the Jesus song. As soon as Jesus said, if you love me, you'll do what I say. Wait a minute. Now, Jesus, you're going a little bit too far now. I got some things to do. I don't know, Jesus. That's going to make me look weird. I can't just be loving everybody. What do you mean love my neighbor? Love those who I hate. Love those who persecute me. Not Jesus. What I think you meant to say was love those who love me. And when people hate on me, hate right back 10 times. See, that's what you meant to say, Jesus. So Jesus, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to do what you intended to say, not what you said. See, that's God's people all the time. We don't like what God has to say because it's too difficult and too hard. And so we use the means of our own self and we end up becoming God within ourselves. But let me move on because watch what it says. The anger of the Lord in verse 14 burned against Moses and he said, is that not your brother Aaron the Levite? Now here's the thing. If I was God, that's why I'm not, I would have just slapped him, man. I would have hurt a brother because he come back giving me excuses. But Lord, but Lord, why me? God says, wait a minute, man. Listen, okay, there's your brother. If you say you can't talk, then your brother can help you. And Moses, looking now, said, what? See, God removed his excuse. God is removing his excuse. Why? Because when God is moving and he have his people to be on a mission, he remove all excuses. He uses whatever we may have, and he says, now go and do what I have called you to do. In verse 17, it says, you shall take in your hand this staff with which you shall perform signs. So he's telling Moses now what he's going to do. Moses never asks God for anything. God is directing him where to go. And it's very difficult when it's not your choice to be directed where to go. In verse 20, he says, so Moses took his wife and his sons and he mounted them up on a donkey and returned to the land of Egypt. Moses also took the staff in his hand. I want you to see, in verse 17, he told Moses to take the staff. In verse 20, Moses took the staff. So God not only uses what we have, but he provides what we need. He took the staff and he took Moses and he's directing Moses. He's telling Moses where to go, but he's also given him the ability to do that which he's called him to do, even though Moses doesn't have the skill within himself. He removed all excuses. He says, here is Aaron, and watch what's going to happen. He takes the ordinary and makes it extraordinary. He takes a staff and makes it a miracle working machine. God is now taking a piece of stick. He said, take that staff and keep it with you. Take it wherever you go. And watch what happens in Exodus 7, verse 9 through 10. It says, when Pharaoh speaks, God is now telling Moses, when Pharaoh speaks, work a miracle. Say to Aaron, take the staff and let Aaron throw it down. It's going to turn into a snake. But then we see in chapter 7, verse 15 and 17, he says, now go to Pharaoh in the morning, and you shall take in your hand the staff and say, thus says the Lord. And when Pharaoh don't listen, you take that staff and you hit the water. It's going to turn into blood. In chapter 8 and verse 5, it says, then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the river, over the streams and over the pools, and make frogs come up out of the land of Egypt. And so Aaron did as Moses commanded. I want you to see something here. Moses is speaking to Aaron, telling Aaron what to do. God told Moses to take the staff. Moses takes the staff. Every time it's time to do something, Moses is now giving the staff to Aaron, saying, Aaron, do this. And Aaron is doing it. In chapter 8 and verse 16, then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, and it may become gnats throughout the land of Egypt. And Aaron did it. And there were gnats all over the land. But something happens in chapter 9. Because we saw for about 5 chapters Aaron taking Moses' staff and doing stuff. But something happens when God has you to do something. In the midst of it, we sometimes catch ourselves and realize we can't give any more excuses. Because the passage says in Exodus 9:23, Moses stretched out his hands towards the sky, and the Lord sent thunder and hail and fire came down. Now see, Moses stretched out his staff, not Aaron. So something interesting happened. And then in chapter 10, verse 13, it says, so Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and the Lord directed the east wind, and now we see this east wind coming, bringing locusts. So wait a minute, Moses now is holding out the rod. Fire, hail is coming down. Now he's holding out the rod again. Locusts are coming. Now in chapter 14 and verse 16, it says, as for you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand. So Moses now using the staff himself. It's not using Aaron anymore. Now he's gathering up the people. He told Pharaoh, God said to let the people go. Pharaoh wouldn't listen. You know, that's why he brought all the plagues. Finally, the angel of death came. Firstborn died. Pharaoh got upset. Pharaoh said, let these people go. They're going. Moses now leading like 2 million plus people, leading them through this desert. And they got to the place where they got to this sea. It's called the Red Sea. Didn't know what to do. Moses then takes the same staff, that stick that the Lord told him to use, and he holds up this stick, and the sea goes apart. So Moses is an obscure object. This, let's call it what it is, a piece of stick, is not only calling down fire, hail and fire and locusts and frogs and all these stuff, but it's now parting seas just because he held up a stick. Something is wrong with that picture. In chapter 17, verse 5, then the Lord, now see, so the people came through. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, pass before the people and take with you some of the elders and take it in your hand, your staff, with which you struck the river now, and go. Because the people now, they got on the opposite side, and the waters closed behind them, and Pharaoh and his army died within the midst of the sea after it closed behind them. And now they're on the opposite side, but they're thirsty and they're crying out. And God tells Moses, take your stick. And behold, I stand in chapter 17, verse 6. Behold, I stand before you. There is a rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it. It says, and Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So Moses now takes his staff, the same staff that just opened the Red Sea. The same staff is now bringing water from a rock. But even past that, after they got the water from the rock, they were now in the land of the Amalekites, and Amalek is there, and you have to go and fight Amalek. And as he's fighting Amalek, God told Moses to hold your staff up. As long as your staff is up, Joshua's going to win. You put your staff down, Joshua's going to lose. Now, here is what is so interesting, because we see Moses, this man who was born a slave. He's now on a mission for God. This man who was once a prince, this ex-murderer who was in exile, this sheep herder, this man is now, who he went out and performed these great miracles and delivered God people using a stick. I don't think you noticed that. You can call it what you want. Make it sound pretty. Put some gold on it. It's still a stick. It's a dead piece of tree limb. That's all it is. Now, we need to understand when we are on a mission that God would equip us for service. See, he's going to use what you have, and he's going and he will provide you with what you need. He's not only going to use what you have, but he's also going to provide what you need. But here's the thing. He's going to take your ordinary and make it extraordinary. So I'm going to just ask you this question right now, because I'm done. Where is your stick? See, I want you to understand, God took that which was ordinary and made it extraordinary. Moses had no idea when he was giving God excuses. God says, what is that in your hand? So I'm just simply asking, what is in your hand? Because God has called you to service, and here's what Jesus says. Greater things you will do. Greater things you will do. So Moses had a stick, and Moses' stick opened the water. Moses' stick turned water into blood. His stick made frogs appear. His stick brought down gnats. His stick brought down fire from heaven. His stick gave people water to drink. A piece of stick. Where is your stick? Because God has some sticks in here and you're not using them. He simply wants to know, what are you going to do with your stick? What? Some of us are just like Moses, though. You know, we want to give excuses. Lord, I can't do this. Lord, I can't do that. But watch what God is going to do. God is going to use that which in your life that you don't even know how significant it is. He's going to take that insignificant thing and make it significant when you move with him. When you get on the mission that God has called you to be on. See, because here's the thing. Most of us don't understand. We've been herding sheep for so long. We've been in palaces for so long. We don't understand God was preparing you for the desert. Why? Because your blessing is in the desert. How do you know your blessing is in the desert? Because God said so. See, when you get there, you're going to keep looking back at, man, I was a prince before. Man, I was a shepherd before. Man, we had grits and fish and grits and we had everything right. But Lord, now you have us eating this quail stuff. Lord, what's going on? See, people would start to complain, but when you got your stick, you know what God is going to do because you saw what he did with a stick. And if you would just trust him with it. See, here's the thing. If we would just trust God with our stick can bring healing. Our stick can bring restoration. Our stick can calm the storms in our, see, our stick can part seas. Our stick can make bad things good. Our stick, when we're thirsty, can bring forth water. If we would only give God our stick, if we would only take our stick and use it. What is your stick? That thing that you believe have no value because you're trying to be like someone else. You're trying to do what someone else is doing. You want to be just like them. Go get their type of education. Do what they are doing. But God called you to do something different. He called you to do something only your stick can do. See, here's the thing. Folks keep telling us, you have to do this and you have to do that in order to succeed. You have to go this way and you have to go that way. But no one wants to go Yahweh. Everyone wants to follow the ways of man. And see why? The ways of man, it looks so good. It looks so right. It's all set together. If you do A, B, C, this is going to happen. Let me share something with you right now. God has a plan that no one can understand for your life. And here's the thing. When you start giving excuses and, well, Lord, I'm done by now. Lord, I'm 65. Lord, I'm 70. Lord, I can't do it no more. Lord, everything on me is hurting. Lord, you know how I feel in the morning when I rise up. Lord, what's going on with me? God has said, wait a minute. Moses was 80 years old, and an 80-year-old man took his stick, and when he took his stick, he said, Lord, I can't do this. God said, watch me do it through you. All I'm saying, it doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how young you are. It doesn't matter where you came from. You could have been born in the ghetto. It doesn't make a difference. God is going to use you. He's going to take your stick to do his will. He's going to take your stick to do his work. Will you give God your stick? I'm just saying. I don't think we understand. It's something about the simple things in life. It's something about the simple things in life that we can't see. Some people believe that you need to have this degree and that degree to do what God has called you to do. Some people believe you need A, B, and C. Why? That's what the system has told you. There is a God who, in spite of the system, he has something in your hand. Something that seems so insignificant, but only you have it. This is your stick. It could be your voice. It could be your hands. Whatever it is, he has it. You have it. All he's calling you to do is to use it for his glory. Will you use your stick for God's glory? I'm done. I don't know about you, but I see God take the ordinary and make it extraordinary. Come on, how many of you have ever seen a stick turn into a snake? See, you just let it go by you because you heard the story. But have you thought about it? How in the world could a stick turn into a snake? See, you heard the story, so you take it for granted that a stick turned water into blood. A stick changed the molecular structure of liquid. A stick brought forth DNA because DNA was in the water. A stick. How can a stick do that? A stick touched the dust and gnats started to fly around. Wait a minute, flies don't come out of the dirt. How is it that a stick brought gnats out of the dirt? Wait a minute, that wasn't enough. A stick touched the water and frogs came leaping out. I don't think you understand. How can a stick do that? A stick went up in the air and fire came down from heaven. How can a stick do that? I am telling you, how can a stick go over water and part a sea? How can a stick do that? A stick can't do that. How? He wasn't done with it. He wasn't done. I don't think we understand because we see the story. We see the story of how they were thirsty. How they were thirsty. They didn't go to Osaka, right? Moses just touched a rock and sweet water came out. Your stick just don't produce water. It produces sweet water. I don't think you understand. When God has your stick, you don't have no regular water. This is no Osaka. It is sweet water. I don't think you understand. When you're fighting, when you're in your fight, here's what's going on. God has you to win. But because your stick is not being held up, you're being defeated in life. Where is your stick? God has a stick for you. Are you using your stick? I'm just saying, God is an awesome God. It wasn't about Moses. It wasn't about his ability or inability. God said, I am going to speak through you. I am going to do this work. God is saying to you, I am going to speak through you. I am going to do a work. When God is moving, if we would just trust God, even though we don't understand what's to come, if we would just trust God, if we would just take whatever we have and place it in his hands, watch how he does the miraculous in our life. I'm just saying, truly saints, if we would trust God with a simple thing as a stick, he does wonders. And I'm so glad that he didn't tell Moses to go back to Egypt and consult the princess to get the strategy on how you should build aqueducts in order to get water. I'm so glad that he didn't go to the learned people and ask them how to get food when there was no food in the desert, because it came down from heaven. And see, I just want you to understand that all the normal ways of man made no sense to Moses and what he was doing. And by the way, Moses was freaking out. Don't believe Moses. Moses didn't know what was going on. When God told him to do something and he did it, I'm sure Moses was like, whoa. Look at God move. He was just waiting on the next thing for God to do, because God showed up in his life and did something that he never expected. This is why Moses said, no, not me. He didn't want to do it. And most of us, I know I said it, Lord. I said to the Lord, I will never be a pastor. I said it. I'll never be a pastor. And I was serious. And guess what God said? I'm going to use your stick. You think you're going to school to do this and that, but that's my stick. And I'm going to speak through you, and people may not like you and they may not want to hear you, but you will speak my word and you will know my word. And when you say my word, I'm going to use your stick. Our Father, who art in heaven, we glorify you this day, O God, and we give you praise, Father, for all that you have done and for all that you are doing. And Father, we know that when you are moving in the life of your people, you do the miraculous. And Father, I know that you are moving in this congregation, oh God, to do your will. You're moving in us individually, and you're moving in us corporately and you're moving in us collectively to do your will, oh God. And even though it may not make sense to us, we know, oh God, that every plan that we may have, you will order our steps according to your perfect will and plan. And so we call on you, the living God, the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. You who came, you who existed before all things, and before you there was nothing, and after you there is nothing, for in you all things hold together. You are the pre-existent eternal God, our Father, and we call on you, thanking you, oh God, for who you are. And Father, this day, our desire is to bring glory to you. I pray that you would help us to use the gifts that you have given to us. The things that we may perceive to be insignificant, that stick that you have placed in our hands, help us to use it to bring glory to you. And Father, know that whatever it may be, for you've given us all different abilities and different gifts and different things to be used. Let us not try to be like the other person. For there was only one Moses. There's only one Joshua. There's only one Terren. Father, let everyone know that they have to be themselves, because you will use what they have. You have gifted them. You have called them out of darkness into your marvelous light. Use this local body, oh God, to transform our sphere of influence for your glory by the preaching of the word, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Father, for everything that you're doing in and through us, we will magnify your holy name. Let's give the Lord a hand of praise.